Welcome back. Once again, I'm working on my endgame tactics, which is one of the several weaknesses that I listed in a video not too long ago, talking about the things that I'm trying to focus on. A couple of recent rapid games, which I'm going to look at here, have some great examples of the kinds of things that I need to work on and maybe some lessons that I can learn, and maybe one of you will learn something as well. If you'll notice the new chess.com logo on my screen, that's because I found out today, after all these months, that if you're making a video or streaming with chess.com website, you're supposed to have the logo prominently displayed. I did not know that. So hopefully I won't get all my past videos deleted over that, but we'll see. Anyway, right here, according to the engine above me, we're drawn. I'm playing with the black pieces. We're even on material. Nobody has any passed pawns. Our pawns are entirely symmetrical. These are the pawns in question right now. We both have bishops. We both have rook. The problem right now is that both of my opponent's pieces, remaining pieces, are pointed at this pawn, and I can't defend it with as many pieces as they're attacking with because my bishop is a light squared bishop and my pawn is on a dark square. So I understand why the engine is saying to do this. I didn't know that during the game. I didn't think about that. At this point, once they moved the rook into position, to attack this pawn, in the heat of the moment with only a minute and 20 seconds left, I guess panicked and thought that pawn is lost. I have to have a different strategy. Clearly, the solution to that is to move it up one. On the light square, a4, the opponent's bishop will not be able to see it because the opponent's bishop can only see the dark squares. It can't see the light squares, right? That seems fairly obvious. Also, my bishop would be defending it at that point. My bishop is currently able to attack their remaining a pawn. If I moved up and they moved up, I could plant my bishop right there, protecting this pawn and the pawn protecting the bishop, and I think that would be great. I didn't do that. I gave the pawn up for lost and went after their bishop, which naturally, and as the engine suggests, they took my pawn. Now here, it's saying I should move this pawn, and I'm not entirely sure why. Possibly to prevent movement by the opponent's kingside pawns, possibly to give my king an extra out. I wasn't really worried about my king right now, because again, my opponent does not have a light squared bishop, and my escape square is a light square. So if I eventually moved the rook off somewhere, or this rook came down, I have a fairly safe escape route. Regardless, that's what the engine is suggesting, e5 or h5, or rook to c1, which I didn't see that for a couple of moves, but that would have been okay, because I could have then had a discovered check, something like that, depending on what the opponent did, and I would have been attacking their rook while they were in check. I did the bishop move first, and one empty one move threat on the rook. And here the rook probably should have gone back to protect this back rank. It's also saying it could have gone back here. I think that's pretty good because it protects this pawn. And then even if I do check, their king comes up one, and I can't go to the second rank to check again because their rook would be there. But they didn't do that. They just moved up one to attack my bishop. Rather than getting it out immediately, I went for the check first. The king only has one legal move. Now here, I didn't know this was the best stockfish move, but I knew I didn't want to leave my rook there while I saved my bishop, because it's on a dark square. I am at least becoming slightly aware of the differences between bishops, knights, and these other pieces. The bishops are very limited in the end game. They are long-range pieces, but each one of them can only ever see half the board. So I did remember to, if I'm going to park my rook, I'm going to park it on a light square. So I did that, and the king moved into a little kind of a barricade here that I'm going to have trouble breaking through. And wow, my next move is so obvious to me at this point. I missed that during the game. Not only does that remove this pawn and it evens up our material, but it protects my bishop. I didn't see that. I moved my bishop. My thinking was if they did something like this, trying to pin it, I was going to move my king there anyway at some point, and could have protected the bishop from there. That was the idea. Also, I was thinking at some point I'm going to have to go through here or protect some sort of pawn push on that side. My opponent made one of their better moves, according to the engine. And here comes a very important principle that I just learned recently in reading my Jeremy Silman books. There are 3 basic rules of rooks called rooks belong on, or one is that rooks belong on open files. Now that tends to be more in the opening or early middle game. One is rooks belong on the 7th rank, which mine currently is, or 2nd rank if you're playing with the black pieces. And rooks belong behind passed pawns. I forgot this very important rule during this game, and going through this analysis is going to help me remember that. That's why the engine is suggesting rook to a2. Because if I get my rook behind that passed pawn, they're going to have a very hard time promoting it. One reason in this game is because their dark squared bishop does not guard the promotion square, whereas my light squared bishop can guard the promotion square. And of course my rook behind the pawn will be indirectly guarding that square. So they're going to have a hard time advancing it. If I did this, they would then need to come down here, which it suggested earlier for them. So I would have to protect my bishop. Then they would have to get this bishop out of the way of the pawn somehow, safely. Well, once the rook moves, the bishop could get out of the way here maybe. Then the pawn can move. But again, if my rook is behind it, that makes a lot of difference. I didn't put my rook behind it. I challenged the bishop. And then the bishop challenged me. And you can see an advantage. We started this in a drawn position. The advantage starting to creep up for my opponent. Here, the computer is very clearly saying, go back to the spot you just left here and get behind that passed pawn. I didn't see that. I continued to attack the bishop. And that was a huge mistake. You saw the bottom drop out. And the opponent made their best move, which is to continue advancing the pawn. Now these two pieces protect each other. And the computer is saying, go back here, because you have to get behind the passed pawn. Again, I missed it. And I tried to get in front of the passed pawn, which is a mistake. So the pawn advances. I got in front of it. The pawn advances. Now look at this. What can I even do? I decided to guard my rook with the bishop, because again, their bishop can't guard that corner square, but my bishop can. This ended up saving the game for me. But not yet, because my opponent had to make some mistakes first. They attack the bishop. I move the bishop attacking the rook. They bring the rook down. I finally move that pawn, so my king has an extra square to escape from. They're trying to get here on b8, where they would be checking me and challenging my rook at the same time. I'm about to lose my rook, and there's not much I can do about it. Because if I move the rook, they're just going to do that anyway, and then advance the pawn behind it. So I did this. I was pretty proud of this move, indirectly guarding my rook and the promotion square at the same time, while challenging their rook. Pardon me. They went where I expected them to, so I had to sacrifice my rook here to prevent the pawn from promoting. But now they can't promote. This is the problem with the opposite colored bishops. The only thing that can dislodge my light squared bishop is if this king, well, it can't go here. If this king can somehow get down here, well, it can't go there either. It would have to go this way to get to my bishop. That's a long road to walk, while my king would be trying to knock off these pawns. Now it says right now they should do this with their king to f4, but it says, the engine says a couple of moves later they would end up not moving their king. They would be doing something else. Regardless, the problem is that in order to dislodge my bishop, they're going to have to go this way. And before they can get there, I can have my king over there. They're not going to be able to come through. My bishop, of course, is blocking off these squares. So they're going to have to try to do something over here with these pawns, or try to bring their king all the way over there. I don't think they thought about bringing their king all the way over there. They saw this pawn unprotected, so I protected it. And now look at the advantage, how it's changed. They advanced a pawn. That lost most of the rest of their advantage. Now here, the engine is suggesting that I take this pawn. And it's fairly obvious to me why. If I let them take me and I take back, their king captures, and I've lost 2 pawns for 1. But if I take now, this little wall here, my G, F, and E pawns prevent the king from getting any closer. Right here. And they're ready to meet any advances from these pawns. So in hindsight, it's very clear that I should have just taken this. It also would have, if they took with the pawn, would have split this one off to be isolated. I assume if I took, they would take with the king, but then that would have left the h-pawn isolated. And I think I would have been much stronger over here, in addition to continuing to block this square, being down a pawn at this point. But I didn't take that pawn. So they took. Now here, the computer is confused, but it says I'm in bad shape. I just need to run away with my king or block this pawn. But here I made the mistake of capturing that pawn. Pardon me. And so their king captured back, which, as I said, the downside of me not taking, I lose 2 pawns for 1. Now they do end up with an isolated pawn, but now I only have 2 here. And they're only guarding these squares. So the king has a route through if it wants it. Now here, the computer recommends me moving the bishop out from in front of that pawn. It's okay because I can still protect that square from there, but I can also guard more space if I need to. I can't guard that promotion square for that h-pawn, but, or even here it says. And I think you'll see the reason why the bishop to b7 or even c6 would turn out to be great later, but at this stage in the game, there was no way that I was going to see that. I played e5 to prevent them from playing e5, but also if they were to play f4 at this point, I'm taking it and have a passed pawn of my own. So they brought the king back here, I guess perhaps to protect this push and be able to capture. They have a significant advantage at this point if they play h4. Because I can't really block that pawn and defend this one at the same time. They did play h4. So significant advantage. Again, you see the computer recommending bishop to b7, bishop to c6 to get out of that corner, because in the corner the only way I can move is this way. But if I move out just a little bit, I'm still guarding the corner, but I have more lateral movement. Anyway, somewhere here in a turn or two, I noticed that this reminded me of a position from another game. These 2 pawns with the king on this diagonal. In that case, I had a queen, not a bishop, but the king ended up sitting right there between those 2 pawns, and putting my queen there was checkmate. Because the pawns guard those 2 squares and the queen hit all of these. And I don't think I noticed it just yet, but here in a second something reminded me of it. Maybe it was when the king moved there that I thought about it. But of course now I have to come back to defend this pawn. So I do. Then that pawn marches forward. Now I have a choice. Do I go here and let them take and then take that pawn? Engine says no. Engine says stay right where you are. Get this bishop here. And the reason is why. Because if I do this, I'm still guarding the promotion square. Right now, if they check me, I can sidestep, probably this way. Let's say they check me, and I go here. Do you see the engine now? Their king has to get out of there. If they instead go for promotion, that's mate. Right? Their pawn's blocking their escape square. My king is blocking this escape square. Okay, but that's not what happened. I went to block the pawn. Big mistake. Right? And then I thought, oh no, they're just going to take this. But then I thought, well, then I can take this. But then they're going to take that, and they're going to have 2 passed pawns right in the middle. And I thought I was for sure lost here. But I kept playing. and their king went to protect their pawn instead of, that's when I realized I have to come back and protect my pawn. When they moved their bishop, it finally sunk into my thick skull that I needed to move mine as well. So I did. And here, I have to think of a way to trick them into coming back to this square. Whether it's going here, because that would work, maybe. Or at least it would be close. I don't know. No, now they're protecting this. I don't know. But I didn't have to trick them because they moved there on their own, and I won. So, anyway, there were some in-game tactics you saw here that I remembered from other games and actually used, and then you saw the other ones that I missed. There's one other game that I can go through a little more quickly. I might as well throw into this video since we're already at 15 minutes. Okay, now this is the other game. The first one was a blitz game. This one is a rapid game, but we're down to blitz type times. And unlike the other one where I began with an even rated position, that if I had just done the right thing, we could have maybe drawn, or we both would have had equal chances. In this one, I've already made my mistakes. I'm down a full piece, as you can see, but my compensation is 2 passed pawns. The reason I have moved my king here instead of trying to protect one of these pawns is that we just had a queen trade. They captured my queen and I recaptured with my king. And my opponent made the best move, or one of their best moves, which was to take my passed a pawn. Because if they don't take it now, I mean, I could get a rook behind it and it's pretty close, right? So they took it. Now this one's in danger. I mean, I could move it or I can protect it. I don't know which one would be better. Computer says slightly better to move it, but it's about even. I protected it. In this case, I did remember rooks belong behind passed pawns. Okay. Now, my opponent, not sure exactly what they were thinking here when they did this. They must have been thinking that I was about to move it here, and I did. But right now I'm willing to sacrifice that for this piece, because it's that piece that's giving part of what's giving them the advantage right now. If they capture and I capture, we're completely even on material, each with a rook, each with 2 pawns, none of which are passed yet. And then I made the mistake of, oh no, first they did this. Now, I think I can't protect that pawn. It's gone, isn't it? But I can. As you can see, the engine is suggesting moving it forward. They're not going to waste a rook for 1 pawn, I don't think. But instead of that, here I make a mistake that's not even counted as a mistake because I already had such a disadvantage. I challenged empty threat on the knight, and they took the pawn. Okay. So now, what do I do? Engine suggests king to f2. Rook to c3 to guard this pawn. That's actually a good idea. All I know is that I'm going to have a hard time getting to that pawn. This pawn guards these 2 squares. So how is my king going to get there? I can't go to f3. If I go this way, I can't come around that way either. If I try to go this way, that pawn guards that square. So I mean, I can get to this g pawn, but I can't take it. But I moved my king anyway. I guess not. I hadn't yet seen that I couldn't get around that way, or maybe I was thinking of guarding an advance with this pawn at some point. Moving that king saved me. If I had left it there and, I don't know, moved this pawn, that would have been a beautiful fork, maybe. But after I moved my king, they did that anyway. And so you see, my opponent lost all their advantage by this. This was a blunder because it flat out hangs this rook. But it doesn't give me a huge advantage. The computer just thinks I have slightly better chances now. And I think the reason I have slightly better chances now is because my piece is more mobile. That's the only thing I can think of. Because they actually do have a passed pawn now that this knight just took my last remaining e-pawn. This pawn's not passed yet because of the g-pawn. But the rook is very mobile, can get to almost any place on the board pretty quickly, within a couple of turns, whereas the knight has to make slow hops across the board. But they checked me. It moved kind of slow there. You saw that, right? Okay. Maybe I'm overtaxing my machine. We'll finish this up quickly. I didn't make the best move here according to the machine, but I do know I want to get in front of this pawn. I'm in check. I have to move anyway. Going forward, that doesn't help anything because that pawn guards that knight, and that knight guards the square that the pawn wants to move to. But I did think I can get in front of it. So that's what I did. Yeah, it's moving slow now. And even if they check me, I can get in front. I can stay in front, pretty sure. At least for a while, especially with the help of my rook. I don't know why the engine is suggesting g5 at this point. I think I probably just would have taken it. Maybe. I don't know. My opponent made an empty threat on my rook, which wasn't great. All I know is I want to keep these two pieces as far apart as possible, and certainly not on any square where a knight can fork them to just end up winning my rook. But anyway, I used this opportunity to check, and the king moved out of check toward my rook. So, thinking about the principle of not wanting these pieces to be that close together, I just moved back. That's, again, one of the advantages of the rook. It can go the width or length of the board in one move, and I'm trying to use that to my advantage. Another empty threat on my rook. Another check. This time with the pawn in the background. If the king doesn't move to protect that pawn, or if the knight doesn't block, I'm going to win the pawn. But the king did move to protect the pawn, but that turns out to be a big blunder. And I didn't know that at the time, obviously, but I did the right thing. The blunder is that it should have moved here, pretty sure, or blocked with the knight. Because going back one move, yeah, it's just a block with the knight. Not only does that protect this pawn, it keeps this pawn safe behind the knight and the king. But doing this allows me to get to this pawn. And if black moves the knight to protect it, they're going to be in trouble. They did move the knight to protect it, but that's not that great. Now the engine says I should check again here, but I don't know why. Oh no, it's changed its mind. It says I should go here. That I don't understand. Stockfish knows a lot more than I do. But I did understand that they can't protect this pawn if I go right here. That's what I did. Oh, I went there. I forgot. It was one of those two that I was thinking of. I wanted to challenge the knight, which is completely undefended. It has to move, and then I'm going to win this pawn instead of just having to blockade it for a while. That's their best move, but it loses the pawn. Now the knight's in danger, and it needs to go here, which is a protected check. I would still have the advantage, but that's where that knight needs to go. And in the heat of the moment, my opponent did that. That's what I didn't know I was winning until right then. I knew I had clawed my way back from losing, but I didn't realize I had an advantage at this point. Wow, that bar is jumping up and down, isn't it? What is Stockfish thinking about there? Yeah, it went down to 2, back up to 6. But anyway, that was the final mistake, and at that point I knew I had it. Because I do know how to checkmate with a rook and a pawn. I mean, a rook and a king. Perhaps my opponent thought that I couldn't, because a lot of people at my level, I notice, have trouble if these are the only 2 pieces left. But I've been working on this. Again, one of the many weaknesses I've been working on is my endgame. And one of the endgame things that many people at about the 11,000 to 1,100 rating have trouble with is checkmating with these 2 pieces. Now, I know I didn't do it perfectly. That, for example, wasn't the best move because it allowed the king to go there. But I forced it to go back, and now it has to go back again or sideways, and I incrementally... It can't go forward now. It's going to lose this pawn. Stockfish says that wasn't the best move in that position, but I knew if I get rid of this pawn, I can checkmate that king. So that's what happened, and it moved toward my rook, and I took the rook to the other side of the board, and now all I have to get is the opposition, which is when the kings are opposite each other. That means we block off all these squares, so if I'm able to do that, I would win. But as long as the king keeps moving away from my king, I have to chase it to a corner, which we did. Now it comes here. I know if I go to get the opposition, it's just going to get out of the opposition, so I waste a move with the rook. I learned this from some famous person's video. Now it has to either go to the corner and allow me to go here, or go and move into opposition, which it did, and I won. But you saw that in this game, the reason that I came back from that disadvantage, one of the reasons, is that my opponent was not as good at endgames as I was. And the other one, I think they were about as good as I was. They just made a fatal mistake with their king at the end. But anyway, thank you for watching. If you had some advice or you noticed something that I missed, feel free to chime in the comments. I do read all of them, and always trying to learn more. Thank you for watching.